I asked a question yesterday on my Twitter account. Is it time to set a date or circle a date on the calendar for an end to the marijuana prohibition? And I asked that question simply because of the developments that have taken place over the last several weeks, particularly with Canada's chiefs of police last week saying, or earlier this week saying, that perhaps police officers should have the option of handing out a fine for personal possession of marijuana as opposed to either looking the other way or laying a criminal charge. In Seattle, Washington, police officers were handing out Doritos instead of arrests or fines during Hemp Fest. And the response on Twitter was pretty good, and the response on email was quite strong to Roy at RoyGreenshow.com. And I have to tell you that by majority, and not by an insignificant majority, people are saying that it's time to circle a date on the calendar. Whether or not they agree with it, many say I don't agree with legalizing marijuana, but it is inevitable. Whether or not they agree with it, they are saying, by majority, people who are sending me emails, that it is time to circle a date on the calendar. Well, later on today, we'll be talking to Alan St. Pierre. He's the executive director of NORML, the pro-marijuana organization out of Washington, D.C. They have Canadian chapters as well. And we will have also joining us from outside her husband's prison where she is visiting, Jodie Emery will be with us from CannabisCulture.com. And we will include some of your phone calls. Just a reminder that later on in the program, Jodie Emery is going to be joining us, and from CannabisCulture.com, Marc Emery's wife. She's just been visiting Marc at his prison where he's serving his time in the United States, and we'll also be joined by Alan St. Pierre, the executive director of NORML in the United States. That's the marijuana activist organization, the national organization for the reform of marijuana laws. And given what's been going on, and particularly in the last few weeks, even the last few days, as I've been suggesting on the program and on Twitter and on my blog, RoyGreenshow.com, follow me on Twitter at The Roy Green Show, that perhaps the time has come to circle a date on the calendar for the end of the prohibition against marijuana. Whether you agree with it or not, perhaps the time has come to circle a date on the calendar. When you get chiefs of police in this country saying, hey, look, we need our cops to have an alternative to laying criminal charges or looking the other way when it comes to individuals personally possessing marijuana, we need to be able to hand out fines. Yeah, the dynamic is really, really significantly changing. And Justin Trudeau, just one toke over the line, sweet Jesus. I don't know how big of a deal that is. We talked about it yesterday. I don't know how much influence Trudeau has in that one toke business. It's just too contrived. But the issue is significant, and we'll talk to Alan St. Pierre, and we'll speak with Jodie Emery in the next hour. Now, you'll like it. Stay with us. Next hour, Jodie Emery from CannabisCulture.com, along with Alan St. Pierre, the executive director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Is it time to circle a date on the calendar for the doing away of prohibition of marijuana? And we'll hear from Walter and his family on how their week away from their beleaguered life turned out, thanks to our Roy Green Show listeners on the Chorus Radio Network. But I've been telling you over the last particularly 24, 36 hours, and I tweeted it, and it's on my blog, and I've said it on the air, whether you agree with it or not, circle a date on the calendar for the end of the prohibition of marijuana. Now, Barack Obama won't be happy with me, not that he listens to this program all the time. Likely the Prime Minister will not be happy with me. Justin Trudeau's too busy puffing to care. Justin's looking for the Doritos. And in Seattle, at Hemp Fest, which is the largest sort of pot gathering, I don't know what you call it, Hemp Fest, police in Seattle were handing out Doritos instead of tickets, which I think is really an interesting development. And in Canada, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, if I've got this right, ratified a resolution which would provide police officers with more options than laying a simple possession charge or looking the other way, which is their option now in cases of simple possession of marijuana. Vancouver Chief Constable Jim Chu introduced the motion to have simple possession of marijuana result in a fine. Interesting. Canadian police chiefs calling for collecting taxes for possession of a substance, the possession of which is a violation of the Criminal Code of Canada. Does your head start to hurt? And Justin announced he was smoking pot while in office. And I said yesterday, if I have the timeline correctly, he was doing that when he said he was conflicted about whether he would support the decriminalization of marijuana. It gets confusing. Alan St. Pierre hasn't been with us on this program for a while, but he's been on the show before. He's the executive director of NORML, NORML, in Washington, D.C., the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And Jodie Emery has been with us, and she was with us quite recently from CannabisCulture.com. And Jodie has just been visiting her husband, Marc, at the American prison where he's serving his sentence. Jodie, hi.
Hi. Good to be on the show again, Roy.
Good to have you with us. And Alan, it's been a while. Good to talk to you.
Good afternoon.
So, guys, look, I've said, and I don't care whether it's not important whether people want marijuana legalized or not, from within the context of the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that the dynamic has shifted so significantly that we're at the point where I think you can now look at the calendar, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, maybe not even 2014, but you can start to circle a date where you think the prohibition against marijuana ends in North America and maybe beyond. I guess I'm preaching to the choir, but Jodie, why don't you take it first?
Well, I think it really depends on what we're talking about by saying ending prohibition. I mean, in the United States, of course, they have decriminalization, they have medical marijuana, and they have legalization, but prohibition is still in place federally, and it's still very much in place in many different states and across Canada. So ending prohibition is really a huge goal, but we're taking the steps to get there, and it's great to see so many steps being taken.
Don't you think, though, that given what's been going on and the rapidity with which these steps are following each other, these developments are following each other, well, the guy who wants to be the next Prime Minister of Canada, although, I think Justin's putting his finger in the air and testing the wind quite often when he speaks, and if I were the Liberal leader of Canada, I'd be doing that too right now. But there have been so many rapid developments that it looks like this prohibition is, if it's not knocked out, it's on the way, it's wobbly.
Oh, I'd agree with that for sure. I mean, it's been many times I've been on your show, and for the last few years we've talked about Stop the Violence BC and police and health officers and former prime ministers and premiers. Pretty much everybody is on board with ending prohibition except for the conservatives and some cops and the gangsters. So it seems those who are interested in maintaining the status quo are the ones who are benefiting financially or politically from it, whereas the rest of society, the taxpayers, the community, the families, we're all being forced to pay for prohibition, to maintain criminal organizations in the marketplace, and to keep putting people in prison, including our young people who deserve so much better.
Alan St. Pierre, the executive director of NORML in Washington, D.C. Jodie pointed out, and she's correct, that there's such a patchwork quilt of laws, particularly state laws and resolutions, and sometimes even at the county level or the municipal level, the realities about marijuana possession and use of marijuana, smoking marijuana for medicinal purposes, all the rest of it. Such a patchwork quilt exists, Alan. First of all, can you make sense of that? And then secondly, would you agree that even in the United States, it's time to consider circling a date on the calendar?
Well, indeed, if you get in a car in Portland, Maine, with an ounce of cannabis and you drive to Portland, Oregon, the legal status of that 1 ounce of marijuana will change itself many dozens of times, not only state to state, as earlier referenced, but as you just referenced too, even county to county. And regrettably, I've even seen within a courthouse, one judge and one prosecutor prosecute an ounce of cannabis one way, and the very next courtroom, it's done completely differently. So a patchwork, that's maybe generous in describing what America now has. The date. Well, let's use just 3 very quick points. When NORML was founded in 1970, about 10% of the public supported legalization. Today, it's about 52 or 53%. In many states like California or Massachusetts, we're seeing polling well into the 60 percentile. The Brookings Institute here in Washington just put out a paper indicating that American public has clearly moved, just like, for example, with gay rights, from a point where it was unthought of 25 years ago to the point where there's no going back, and the demographics indicate from the ensuing generations coming up that there's going to be a definite change of attitude such that we do not want to continue to support prohibition. And lastly, I would never bet against now ESPN's Nate Silver. He has a predictive model in place right now indicating by 2020, 60% of Americans will want legalized across the board. So when you get to the 60th percentile, at least in our democracy, generally speaking, the law is reformed.
Well, the politicians will follow suit because politicians do one thing in their lives, their professional lives. It's not govern responsibly generally. That's my assessment of them. Some do try their best. Others don't, frankly. But one thing they all do is they follow votes. They go where the votes are. And their policies are generally amended in order to satisfy the need for votes. Because if you don't get the votes, you don't govern, and that's an anathema to a political party. Let me take a break. We'll come back with Jodie Emery and Alan St. Pierre. And I want to involve you as well, listening on the Corus Radio Network, 1-877-399-9898. 1-877-399-9898. It doesn't matter whether you agree with an end to prohibition of marijuana, just making it legal across the board, and of course having the required resolutions in place and the required laws, like you can't smoke and drive, like alcohol. It doesn't matter whether you agree with a date for the end of prohibition. It just matters whether you believe that we're now at the stage where you look at the calendar and you circle a date and you say, by then, the prohibition of marijuana will end. 1-877-399-9898. Another simpler way of my putting it, do you think it's inevitable and in the shorter term, the marijuana is going to be legal in North America, not just Canada, but also in the United States? 1-877-399-9898. Marijuana has been in the news a lot. Justin Trudeau, the chiefs of police, saying that police officers should have more options than either laying a possession charge or looking the other way. The hand out fines, and in Seattle, the police handed out Doritos at Hamfest. With me, Jodie Emery from CannabisCulture.com, Alan St. Pierre, Executive Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and I'm asking you at 1-877-399-9898 whether you believe it's time for us to circle a date on the calendar for the end of the prohibition to marijuana. Alan and Jodie are going to listen to the call here, and then I have a question for them. Leo in Toronto, what do you say?
Hello.
Yes, sir.
I say for sure it's about 100 years or 80 years since prohibition. It's overdue. The fact that everybody's focused on a 0.001% use of cannabis, which is recreational use, is a big distraction, and it's used as a convenient subterfuge by the government to throw people off by the real topic and that being the use of cannabis as an industrial staple across the board, from fuel to paints to lubricants to textiles to...
Okay, Leo, you're taking me a little more into deeper waters that I wanted to get into. Thank you very much. Alan, what sorts of regulations would have to be in place? I'll get some more callers on in a second, but what sorts of regulations would you want to see in place if marijuana were legalized? What sorts of rules would have to go along with the legalization?
As you indicated earlier, it would look very similar to alcohol. We would have age limits. We would have restrictions regarding when and where the product is sold. Some places in the United States wouldn't allow it to be sold on a Sunday, for example, or might only allow them to be open for 12 hours a day and not into the wee hours of the night. All those sort of local mores and values that we all basically use for our zoning laws would be employed here. And as, again, you referenced drug driving, again, given you can't drive a car impaired like you are under alcohol under the same influence of cannabis. We just have to have the proper testing to discern such. All
right. Jodie, you mentioned criminal gangs, and the point has been made time and again, and it'll be made time and again as we continue now, I think, to move toward this end to prohibition, and that is that it will not put an end to criminal gangs distributing marijuana. They will simply distribute stronger stuff that's not available at the euphemistic government store.
Well, that's always possible, but it really depends on what the government chooses to do. If the government, like in Washington and Colorado, wants to sell marijuana at prohibition-inflated prices, which is about $10 a gram. Those prices are that high only because of the risk-reward system. There's risk involved with dealing with marijuana, so it's more valuable as a reward, and that's why it costs so much. But governments are looking at selling pot legally at these prohibition-inflated prices. But if they just sell at the same price as the gangs, why would somebody want to go pay that plus taxes when they can just go to their dealer and pay the same price? So for governments to successfully remove marijuana from the hands of organized crime, they need to make sure that they sell it at an affordable, cheaper price that people are willing to pay. They need to provide the quality and the quantity and the range in product that's currently available today. But we've also got this incredible problem of an industry that employs millions of people worth billions of dollars, from growing to selling to online dealing with all the legal medical marijuana. There's a huge industry already taking care of marijuana. So when the government says, well, we're going to actually move that industry into other people's hands, well, that's going to be quite a challenge. We've never had, even alcohol prohibition wasn't like this.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting it's going to be a simple venture, and that's a very good answer. Sean in Calgary, time to circle a date, yes or no?
I'd say no. My biggest concern is all this discussion is the young people, the consequences of getting kicked out of school, losing placements, or down the road. If the U.S. doesn't come on board at 6, you can't take your kid to Disney World. Oh, did they lose me?
We are losing you there, Sean. I'm sorry. Rick is also in Alberta. Rick, go ahead, please. Time to circle a date on the calendar, whether you agree or not. Do you think it's time to look at that and say the prohibition is coming to an end?
Yeah, Roy, the date to be circled is sometime in advance of the next federal election, and it's a date to be announced by the Conservatives so they stop looking like such dinosaurs.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Jodie, it seems like Justin Trudeau. I mean, he said he's in favor of, if I've heard him correctly, he's in favor of legalization, not decriminalization, but legalization, and so I expect that to be a platform for the Liberal Party in the 2015 election.
Absolutely. It's already part of their policy. They have endorsed legalization. And really, this is a no-brainer. Politicians are always looking for an issue to get the public motivated, something that the public supports. And I can't think of anything else that enjoys as much support as the legalization of marijuana. So Justin Trudeau, as first potential prime minister to say legalize it, is really just saying something that most people already agree with. And when it comes to politics and Canadians and taxpayers, we know that our top issues are, employment, education, healthcare, and all that.
Yeah, it's going to be a sidebar issue, but it'll be significant. It'll be significant.
We feel powerless with those.
I have a minute, Jodie. I want to ask Alan St. Pierre about Barack Obama. Here's the President of the United States, in less than a minute now for an answer, Alan. President of the United States wants the prohibition to remain in place, but he laughed and joked about smoking marijuana and said, of course he inhaled. That was the point.
Yes, we're in a really odd place here. Of course, this is a man who probably consumed some of the best marijuana in the world growing up in Hawaii and has acknowledged such. So the baby boomers have taken over. I think that's where we're at, where just like Trudeau, they're sort of caught early on between their guilt of being inclined to use it and now looking at the politics, putting their finger in the wind and recognizing cannabis prohibition is coming to an end. It's not a matter of how, it's a matter of when.
All right. I thank you both so much for joining us. Jodie Emery, CannabisCulture.com, Alan St. Pierre from NORML in Washington, D.C. Thank you much.